seated.
Your Honor, if I may.
Yes.
Mr. Jacobs only went 40 minutes, so I was wondering if I could get my 5 back.
Well, we got a commitment to what you agreed to deliver your time.
I was ceding 5 to Mr. Jacobs who did not use it.
I'm sorry?
I was ceding 5 to Mr. Jacobs who did not use it. He spoke for 40 minutes, I believe, from 11:30 to
I don't know.
12:10, which was 40 minutes.
You agreed to do 10.
I actually agreed to 15. I initially stated 20. I gave 5 to Mr. Jacobs who did not use it.
You agreed initially to, let's see,
20.
to 20, and we went to 15.
Right, so that Mr. Jacobs could use it who did not use it.
Denied.
Judge, I will get the marshals again. Hey, Chris, ask her if I can use my other 5 now. I think you don't have the bullets.
Okay, please be seated. Good afternoon. We're ready to proceed with the balance of the opening statements. Mr. Hesnecker, please. You have 30 minutes.
Your Honor, I'm actually going next.
Okay.
That's okay with you.
Mr. Pagano, you have 30 minutes. Sure.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Labor, I want to start where he started. He started by quoting from one of the recordings in the case, and it was a recording from June 27, 2003. And he started by saying to you, everybody's making money, and I can't even get money. He said, I got 2 gorillas, I'm going to chop them up. And something else, I think, but that's essentially what the quote was. And that quote was attributable to my client, Anthony Staino. And Mr. Labor also said, and I wrote these quotes down, and if I get them wrong, I apologize, but he said that these words define what the case is about. He also said that these words were backed up by the LCN. And the reason why I bring this up, ladies and gentlemen, is because, like all conversations and like all words, they must be put in the proper context before you can understand them. And these words were said in a recording made by Henry Scipione when he was recording secretly Anthony Staino. And this recording, this conversation, was orchestrated and planned, and it was a progression of other conversations that led to that conversations. And what Anthony was referring to when he said, everybody's making money and I can't get mine, was almost immediately before that, or a few sentences before that, Henry says to Anthony that he lent this money out to someone named Vinny. And Vinny is Joseph Stone, who was an undercover FBI agent. Well, at that point, on January 27, 2003, Anthony had never met Joe Stone. And in the conversations leading up to June 27, the FBI was coaching and had conversations with, and I'll play you recordings, where they're instructing Henry to get this man mad and angry. And eventually of his money to someone that he doesn't even know, this guy Vinny. And he also tells Anthony that this guy Vinny is not returning my phone calls. And he tells him this weeks before this too. And Anthony doesn't get mad then. But on June 27th, he tells him he's not returning my calls. He's not showing up to meet with me. And they're creating this situation to manipulate his anger and to get him angry. And it's crystal clear, and I'll play you the recordings. But what's important is he also tells Anthony, this guy, not only is he not paying you, but he's making 40% on your money that he's not paying you. And that's when he says, everybody else is making money, but I can't get mine. So, all conversation, and we know this from our own ordinary lives. Sometimes you walk into a room, you walk into the middle of a conversation, and you assume that you know what's being said, and then once you find out what's being said, it's completely different than what you assume it is. Well, every conversation in this case, I will make sure that you're able to put in proper context, because I'll play you the recordings that they may not play for you. Now, what's also important about that conversation on June 27th, and this is the showpiece of their case. And how do I know that? Because it's what he opened up with in his opening statement. That statement is what he opened up with. And he said that is the face of this mob. And that this mob is characterized by that statement. Well, let's talk about that statement and the fear that it instilled in Henry. To this day, October 18, 2012, Henry Scipione still owes Anthony Staino money from that loan. Still, to this day, owes him, according to the FBI's calculations, about $7,000. Henry moves in 2007 or 8 to Las Vegas. And he's recording Anthony for all this time, from 2003, when the conversation that we both quoted earlier is made, until around 2007 or 8. He's recording Anthony on a regular basis. And in those recordings, Henry finally decides to move to Las Vegas. And he calls Anthony one day. And one of the last recordings that Henry makes of Anthony, when he still owes him money, is when Henry is in Las Vegas and he calls Anthony and says, hey, I'm living like Steve Wynn out here. And you know what Anthony says? Not, where's my money? You better get back here. Where I'm sending someone out from the tentacles and the long reach of the Philly mob, the La Cosa Nostra, to come and get you. Anthony said, God bless you. Good luck. So that's the conversation, and that's what it's about. It's about a loan that Henry took from Anthony. It's actually about several loans that Henry had taken from Anthony over the course of many years. So let's get back to the charges in this case. Let me start by giving you a brief overview of what the charges are against Anthony Staino. And by the way, my name is Greg Lugano, and obviously I represent Mr. Staino. And assisting me is Brad Wertheimer, who you might have seen here seated with me earlier, but because of space considerations, he's now seated in the galley part of the courtroom. But he's a lawyer, and he's helping me with the case. But Anthony is charged here with the RICO conspiracy, and Mr. Jacobs went all through that. I'm not going to go through that again. But Anthony is also charged with RICO collection of an unlawful debt. And in the indictment, he's charged with 11 counts of racketeering, collection of an unlawful debt. And there's a table on page 33 of the indictment which lists all the dates and all the payments that Anthony was to have collected from this relates to the Henry Scipione loan, or loans. And if you look at this table, you'll see that the payments start on January 19, 2006, and they go to September 14, 2007. It's a period of about 21 months. And during that time, Henry paid Anthony $3,200. Mr. Jacobs added an extra $300 because probably Anthony deserved an extra $300 that Henry hasn't paid him yet. But the math adds up to $3,200. That, ladies and gentlemen, over 21 months comes out to $40 per week that Henry collecting an unlawful debt, and these are the dates, and these are the amounts. And I will play you recordings from each of these dates, and you'll be able to listen to each and every one of them. And you'll be able to determine for yourselves whether or not this is an extortionate collection attempt. You'll hear them talk, you'll hear them laugh, you'll hear them engage in small talk. You won't hear a single threat from Anthony directed to Henry. And just for a second, let's get back to June 27, 2003. I said that the last payment here is September 14, 2007. But on June 27, 2003, and this is vitally important when you listen to that recording, I ask that you remember this fact, that Anthony is talking to Henry at this point. And he's not threatening Henry. Anthony is telling Henry what to say to Vinny, who's not showing up, who's not returning calls, and who's making 40% on his money. So the reason I bring that up is because Vinny is not a victim here. Agent Joe Stone is not the victim of these collection attempts. Henry is. Anthony never threatens Henry. He doesn't threaten him on June 27 in 2003, and he doesn't threaten him in 2004, 5, 6, or 7. So back to the indictment. This table, these 11 counts in the indictment against Anthony Staino are duplicated. In another table, charging him with extortions of the exact same collections on the exact same loan with respect to the exact same person, Henry Scipione. So if it sounds duplicative, I think it is too. But that's something we'll address later on down the line in closing arguments maybe. But Mr. Staino is charged with 22 counts, the collection of unlawful debt with regard to Henry Scipione, and he's charged with that 11 times, and he's charged with the extortions 11 times. All the same dates, same amounts, same person. And when you look at this table, I ask you to take note of the dates and the amounts paid. And you'll see that Henry paid what he wanted, when he wanted. There were no paid terms that he had to stick to because he feared Anthony. Like I said, he still owes him money to this very day. And so does Vinny. Vinny disappeared from this investigation for, I don't know, maybe reasons that had to do with his professional career. Maybe he moved on and was given a promotion, or maybe they strategically decided to pull Vinny out of the investigation. But my point is, when Vinny is pulled out of this investigation, it's still 2003. It's September of 2003. And at this point, Vinny owes Henry, or Anthony, about $20-some thousand. And what's interesting is, over the course of years throughout this investigation, that $26,000, that principal amount, does not increase. It does not inflate. I wish I could borrow money like that. And you'll hear that in the recordings. The amount, the principal amount, the $26,000 or $25,000, does not go up over the course of 5 years. It stays the same. One of the things that they'll need to prove in order to prove the collection of an unlawful debt with respect to the RICO charges, the 11 counts that are on one of these tables here, is that the rate was a usury rate. And I think one of the lawyers already said that a usury rate is a legal term for an illegal rate of interest. So they need to prove that, and they also need to prove that the money that Anthony lent here was mob money, that it wasn't Anthony's personal money. So they're the two things that they need to prove. And back to Vinny disappeared. Vinny disappears in September of 2003, and Vinny still owes this 20-some thousand at this point. And you won't hear Anthony, you won't see any evidence where Anthony actually goes after Vinny and does something to capture Vinny or to hunt Vinny down to make sure he gets paid his $26,000. Ladies and gentlemen, actions speak louder than words. After June 27, 2003, when Anthony makes these statements that are supposed to define this mob, he meets Vinny. He meets him at Henry's house on July 9th, 2003. And that's also recorded. And not only does Anthony not poke, pinch, or pull Vinny's hair, but he doesn't threaten him at all. They talk about what's owed. Vinny takes on this persona, and this is all carefully orchestrated and planned by the FBI. Vinny takes on this persona of being, quote, and I'm using Henry's words, because Henry had these conversations, and I'll play them for you, with the FBI, where he tells Anthony that he's evasive, he's elusive, he's dodging. He's using these words in the days and weeks before June 27, 2003, to get this man angry. So, ladies and gentlemen, all of these conversations need to be put in the proper context. They need to be put in the proper context in terms of not just days, hours, but weeks and months. Now, like I said, Vinny meets Anthony. Vinny shows up hungover. He's got this role that he's playing. He's clearly, this is clearly something that's thought out. In fact, the FBI actually had meetings in hotels with Anthony, or not Anthony, but with Henry, with the agents. They had what are called debriefings, and they talk about strategy. They talk about how they're going to approach and even attack. They use this word, how they're going to attack Anthony. And I have a recording, and I'll play it for you, where the FBI agent, Dino, leaves on his recorder, and he speaks and has what's called a debriefing with other agents. And they talk about how Anthony is not taking the bait. And Dino is obviously disappointed that he cannot ensnare Anthony in some complex money laundering crimes that Anthony obviously doesn't even understand and never takes the bait. And Dino is disappointed, and he talks about how we need to attack Anthony from different angles, how we need to lock and load and to approach this from some other angle. Why? Because what they're doing isn't working. They also talk on this debriefing recording about how Anthony is lying to them, or how they don't believe him, how he's exaggerating. And you'll also hear that confirmed in grand jury testimony from some of the agents. So it's important to not only put the conversations in the proper context, but it's also important to think about whether or not he's telling Dino the truth. Because Dino and Henry are given scripts. They're given scripts on what to say, and Anthony, on June 27th, is giving Henry a script to say to Vinny. Now, back to the debriefing. The debriefing is also important because the debriefing shows not only the frustration of the FBI and the government in trying to ensnare him in crimes that he's not disposed to commit, but they also express their opinions about how Anthony doesn't have money and how he's waiting to sell a property that he inherited from his aunt in order to engage in this transaction that he obviously doesn't understand with Dino. And they're going to say that this money from this property that Anthony had to sell to engage in this transaction is somehow mob money. Well, it's obviously not, and it's going to be clear from the tapes that it's not. And they also say in this debriefing recording that the mob has no money. So they acknowledge that Anthony doesn't have money, and that the South Philadelphia mob has no money. And you'll hear it. I'll play it for you. So they are some of the charges in this case. They are most of the charges in this case. The charges with respect to Henry Scipione, well, we'll start with the RICO conspiracy, which Mr. Jacobs talked about extensively. There's the RICO collection of unlawful debt, which all relate to Henry Scipione. There's the 11 extortions for the same dates, same payments, same collections with respect to Henry Scipione. And then there's the Dino extortions. And Dino is the FBI agent Dave Sebastiani.
Excuse me.
Now, let me just talk about how these puzzles pieces fit together. Henry, Vinny, and Dino. In April of 2003, the same year that recording was made that Mr. Labor opened on. And the dates are important here, and I'm sorry if I'm going over them too much. You don't have to write them down. You're going to hear them extensively throughout the course of the trial. I'm just trying to help you keep everything in perspective. In the spring of 2003, Henry Scipione goes to the FBI. Mr. Labor, I think, said that he goes to the FBI because he's having problems paying some gambling debts, and some of those debts are to Anthony Stano. Well, one of the reasons, and you'll hear testimony about this, and you'll see evidence about this, but one of the reasons why Henry Scipione goes to the FBI is because he believes that he's under investigation for stealing money from the Pennsylvania lottery. Now, Henry Scipione, ladies and gentlemen, is a thief and a liar, and that's a word that I don't throw around lightly. Where I come from in Frankfurt, those are fighting words. And I wouldn't call Henry Scipione a thief and a liar unless I knew he was. And I know he is because he says he is. And from his God's ears to you, to all of us in the courtroom, you're going to hear him say it because he said in a recording, a suicide recording, that he left for the FBI. And let me just tell you, this is real life now. I mean, this is not part of the charade and part of the investigation and part of the orchestrated and the preconceived, scripted conversation. Henry Scipione actually tried to kill himself in the middle of his work for the FBI and the government here. On June 13, 2003, he started cooperating or makes his first recording in May of 2003. About 6 weeks later, 4 weeks later, he makes a recording, and it's addressed to, and you'll hear it, Jack Martinelli, who's an FBI agent, who was his handler, and Mark Pinero, who was a Philadelphia police officer, who was also one of his handlers. He says, Jack and Mark, I can't take the lies anymore. I can't take life. I embezzled $55,000 or $50,000 from the Pennsylvania lottery. These are his words. You'll hear them. He says also in this recording that not only did he steal $50,000 from the Pennsylvania lottery, he also says that he lied about his now, or soon-to-be, ex-wife's involvement in that crime. So not only does he implicate himself in stealing this money, but he also states clearly on this recording that he previously falsely implicated his wife. This is the kind of person that we're talking. This is the kind of person that they've given a $50,000 contract to. Someone who has implicated his wife falsely in a crime. Someone who has stolen from the senior citizens of Pennsylvania, who has done, in my opinion, far worse crimes than anything charged in this indictment against this man or these men. And someone who was also fired from the Postal Service for stealing money. This is Henry Scipione. You're going to hear it from him, and you're going to see and hear the evidence. There are gambling charges in this case, and the gambling charges in this case relate to the video poker machines. And Mr. Jacobs went through that, and I'm not going to go through it again, but to say that Anthony lawfully, legally, legitimately purchased this vending business, the video poker machine business from M&P Vending. He paid for it with checks, some cash, but mainly checks. He incorporated it. He got a City of Philadelphia business privilege license. He paid payroll taxes. He paid income taxes. He ran it as a legitimate business. And you'll see that evidence. You'll hear from his accountant, and you'll see the bank records in this case. I'm sure the government will introduce them. And that's another thing. There are about 10,000 pages worth of bank records recovered in this case, subpoenaed in this case, that relate to these men. And you'll see through some of those records that Anthony, and I don't know about the rest of them, I'm sure they are too, but Anthony is an ordinary person with ordinary bills, ordinary mortgages. He's got a wife who owns a hair salon. They're regular working people. They're not people that live in gated houses like you see on TV or in documentaries or anything else. This is a very mundane case. However, the government is trying to glamorize it through the use of evidence from enterprises that have nothing to do with these men that existed 10 or 20 years ago. Regarding the gambling charges, ladies and gentlemen, Anthony is not only charged with running the video poker machine business, but he's also charged with being involved in sports betting. You'll hear two recordings from January and February of 2005, when, ironically enough, the Eagles were in the Super Bowl. A much different Eagles team than the ones that lost to the Detroit Lions last week and blew a 10-point lead going into the minutes of the game. A much different team, a much less feared team, and probably a much less profitable team. So I say that only because it's something Mr. Labor brought up in his opening, but I'm not here to make analogies for you here. But my point is that the bet, or two bets, that Anthony is alleged to have taken, and he does, and you'll hear the recordings on it. One is from January of 2005 when the Eagles are in the playoffs, and one is from the following month when they're in the Super Bowl. And Dino, who, again, is recording Anthony for years, it is years by the time he's done. He's recording conversations with Anthony for 3 years. I think he's into it for almost 2 years at this point. He calls in a bet to Anthony, and he asks Anthony if he could put some pizzas on the game. Anthony doesn't take his bet on the Anthony has to call it in to someone else. And not only does Anthony call it in to someone else, but what's interesting is Anthony talks him out of betting so much because he's telling him he's going too heavy. He says, why go crazy? Well, anyone knows that a bookie doesn't talk like that, and common sense dictates that someone who's got an interest in what the bookie's making isn't going to talk someone out of placing $1,000 or $2,000 in bets. He has nothing to do with sports betting. Thank you, Your Honor. If it's anything like the debates the other night, maybe I'll get another 8 minutes or 10 minutes, but I'll try to keep it 5 minutes.
Not here.
Or less even, Your Honor. The investigation here and the role played by Dino was in his role with Anthony was a crooked CPA. He lived a very fancy lifestyle according to his persona. He flew around the world in private jets. He had an oceanfront condo paid for by our tax dollars, I believe. He had an office in Mount Laurel paid for by our tax dollars with staff. He had a fancy car. He had fancy clothes. He had expensive tastes. This is who Dino was. He's in real life, he's a first-generation Italian who speaks fluent Italian, who really has a CPA. He was able to talk about money laundering crimes and financial crimes that Anthony obviously didn't understand, and you'll hear those recordings. The reason why I bring all this up is because this investigation was a theatrical production, second only to Hollywood. They had all the props, and in the debriefing tape that they recorded with other FBI agents, they talk about the props. They talk about the off-site props and getting Anthony to see some of them to legitimize Dino's role. Ladies and gentlemen, I only have a couple more minutes, but let me finish by saying I feel like I have a lot more to say, but you're going to hear it all throughout the course of the trial. We're going to be together for a long time, unfortunately for you. And I'm going to do my best to make sure it's as short as possible. But there are 15,000 or more than 15,000 recordings here in this case. You heard Mr. Jacobs say that repeatedly. Out of the 15,000 recordings, thousands of them relate to Anthony Staino. There's a handful out of those thousands of recordings that are bad recordings, and the one that they opened on is the worst one. And if you listen to it and you follow the transcripts and recordings, you'll see that it needs to be put in proper context. I bring that up, ladies and gentlemen, because out of all those thousands of conversations, you're going to hear a handful of ones that sound bad, where Anthony talks like a mobster, but he never acts like a mobster. Actions speak louder than words, ladies and gentlemen. He never acts on a single thing that he said. He never acts on a single angry thing that he says. The extortion regarding Dino in the bathroom that Mr. Jacobs touched upon. Anthony, you'll hear it. Anthony is so drunk that he can barely speak. And he's telling Dino how he loves him. And you can hear them in the bathroom. Mr. Jacobs said it was a urinal. I think it was a toilet. You can hear them both taking care of their business in the bathroom. And Anthony is hollering things to Dino. I love you, Dino. Dino, don't embarrass me of my friendship for you. Dino, I'm going to finally give you this money that you've been asking me for and pleading with me for months. And Anthony finally agrees to fork over some money to Dino, and you'll hear the recordings, where Dino repeatedly begs and pleads with Anthony to engage in this investment, where he gives him a cereal box with money in it. But in that recording, ladies and gentlemen, Anthony does not threaten Dino in the way that the government is asking you to interpret it to be. What Anthony says to Dino in the bathroom that day, and this will be clear from the tapes, is don't steal my money like Vinny did. Because Vinny disappeared, like I told you before, with Anthony's $26,000 or $25,000. And Anthony, Dino and Vinny were friends. And you'll hear this through the tapes too. Those are the puzzle pieces that I was talking about earlier that need to be put together for you to understand all the relationships here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm through talking. I've talked enough. I've given you an overview of what this case is about. Your commitment to serve as jurors in this case is a huge, huge sacrifice, and I can't thank you enough for it on behalf of myself and Mr. Stainer. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mr.
Thank you, Your
Hetznecker,
Honor.
you have 30 minutes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Hetznecker, and I represent George Borghese, seated right here in the sweater with the glasses on. I want to thank you on behalf of my client and everyone here. I know that for many of you, as Mr. Lugano said, you might consider this a sacrifice, because you are taking time away from your lives, away from your loved ones, away from your jobs. And I know that in the period of time that we will be here together, you may be thinking about that often. But I also know that you all went through this process and answered the 79 questions because you said you could be fair, that you would keep an open mind from start to finish. That's exactly what we're asking you to do in this case. Be fair, be open-minded. Now, the role of a juror is probably the most solemn role you could have aside from serving in the armed forces. Because you collectively, all of you, will decide my client's fate. You will make a decision, in this case, about my client's fate. And we trust that you will do so with an open mind. Now, there are certain rules of court, and I want to talk a little bit about them, such as the fact that the government, in every case, they have the last word. Actually, you have the last word. They have the last closing. And they will have so in this case. That's a rule of procedure, a rule of decorum that has been followed for probably 2 centuries. The rule of decorum, the fact that my client and the other clients sit furthest away from the jury box. That's not something we chose. It's not even something the government chose. It's just a rule of decorum that's been followed, a rule of protocol that's been followed for decades, if not centuries. But there are 2 rules that I want you to keep your eyes on, closely fixed. 2 foundational rules. 2 rules that were established in a beautiful way, architected 2 blocks away 200 years ago. And those 2 rules are more than just rules. They're the foundation of our system. The presumption of innocence. That each and every person charged with a crime in this country is presumed innocent. The second is the burden on the government to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, His Honor Judge Moreno will give you explicit instructions about what those mean. He's already given you some preliminary ones. But I want to talk a little bit about what it means for you. Presumption of innocence. In this case, it's the United States of America versus George Borghese. And I represent George Borghese. And a lot of the issues that Mr. Jacobs talked about affects every single one of them. But what the judge will instruct you here today is that each of you have to make a decision on the charges in the indictment with respect to each individual charge. But the presumption of innocence quotes every single one of them here. It's the United States of America versus George Borghese. the United States versus George Borghese and all their experts, their FBI agents, the state police utilized, the undercover techniques, the wiretaps, the search warrants. 13 years of investigation. My client was in jail for 13 years, under surveillance, in a locked box for 13 years. All of that, they had at their disposal. And my client has the presumption of innocence, and you. Foundational piece of this system, a critical part of the criminal justice system, a guidepost for you in sifting through the evidence in this case. Don't lose sight on that guidepost. The second is the government has a burden of proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Each and every element must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That's their burden. It never shifts. It's not something they embrace. It's the law. It's more than the law. It's what separates our country from all other nations. It's a key part of our democracy because it is brilliantly crafted architectural piece of protection against government abuse. Our forefathers and mothers decided that when you have the power of the government accusing an individual, you can't simply just point a finger and say he's guilty of a crime. You have to prove the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. The second guidepost in your sifting through the evidence in this case. Now, the government comes to you with a theory. And Mr. Jacobs talked a little bit about their theory, but I want to talk about it a little more because I want you to keep your eyes on this as you listen to the evidence in this case. Their theory is that there's this hierarchical structure of the mob. That the mob functions in this structure and it goes from bottom up and pays up. And I think Mr. Laver said that's one of the rules and one of the requirements of the mob. This case is absolutely important because it challenges all of you. And you were selected because of your duty fair. It challenges all of you on the precise principles that this democracy is based on. Is that you don't find anyone guilty based on association. His honorable instruction that being a member of an association, a mob, does not mean you're guilty of a crime. Association does not equate guilt. What the government has tried to do, and Mr. Jacobs mentioned this, is conflate the mob as an association with a racketeering conspiracy. Don't let them do it. Because if you hear from the witness stand, you'll hear the evidence in this case, that's precisely what didn't happen in this case. They may be able to show an association, they will not be able to show a racketeering conspiracy. And how do we know that? Just listen to the evidence. Listen to the witnesses in this case. And by the way, what is evidence? Evidence is what you hear from the witness stand and what you believe. And if you believe that the government would make a deal with a guy who sends individuals to the grand jury to suborn perjury, then that belief will be shattered by the end of this. Because that's exactly what they did in this case. Louis Monticello became the focus and target of their investigation. I want you to listen to my cross-examination of Louis Monticello. I'm going to be very detailed about what he said and what he didn't do. The truth of my client's innocence, the proof of my client's innocence in this case is in the government's evidence and lack thereof. Keep that in mind. With respect to my client has been in jail for 13 years. Louis Monticello grew up with my client. I think Louis Monticello was 14 and my client was 17. They've known each other all their lives. But Louis Monticello has one thing in mind, and that's Louis Monticello. That's what he cares about. So on their radar screen of surveillance, you will see that Louis Monticello pops up. He popped up a long time ago. But Louis Monticello doesn't become the focus of their interest until 2007, when Frank DiGiacomo, a plumber, the fixer, calls himself the fixer, a plumber, a con artist, a degenerate gambler, decides he doesn't want to pay his debts anymore. So he makes a deal with the FBI and the state police. Now, keep your eyes on this, because it's a joint investigation. This is very important for your discovery of the truth of the innocence of my client in this case. The FBI sends Frank DiGiacomo out with a script to talk to Louis Monticello on day one. Day two, Pennsylvania State Police sends the same Frank DiGiacomo out with a script to Louis Monticello. You're going to hear the script. You're going to hear what the conversations are about. Frank Laver got up and said, my client was behind putting out loan shark money, putting out money on the street to come back with high rates of interest. That's not what happened. Louis Monticello took out a loan for $248,000 on his house. Not mob seed money. $248,000 on his house, put out on the street for loan sharking money for his own operation. His partner was a man named Nicky Cimino. Keep your eyes on the ball in this case. Nicky Cimino was his partner. They had a bookmaking operation, and in Louis Monticello's own words, he was the biggest bookmaker in Philadelphia. Well, if he's the biggest bookmaker in Philadelphia, why is he at the bottom of their hierarchy? Because their version of what's going on in this case is completely twisted by the truth in this case, by the facts that we'll hear from the witness stand in this case. Louis Monticello gets bigger and bigger. He starts to build his reputation. He's making tons of money. Lots of money. Not George Borghesi's money. Has nothing to do with George Borghese, who's locked in Beckley, West Virginia federal prison. Louis Monticello visits him twice a year. You heard Frank Labor say that those on the bottom rungs are accountable to those up the chain. Well, they will lay my clients at Capo. Where was the accountability for the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars Louis Monticello was making, spending, and gambling? Where was that? Where was my client's piece of that? You're not going to see it. The truth of my client's innocence in this case is in their evidence. And lack thereof. So the tape recordings with Frank DiGiacomo and Louis Monticello start on December 3rd, 2007. And they go all the way through to July of 2008. Key things you want to keep your eyes on. Does Louis Monticello use my client's name from time to time? Yes, he does. But I want you to hear the context in which he uses it. Louis Monticello, as Mr. Jacobs said, and I'm going to talk about this very, very great detail. Louis Monticello actually strips the perjured testimony of two of the people that owe him money up to the grand jury. He finds out about the grand jury, and he tells them what to say. Did you ever borrow money from Louis Monticello? Yes. These are his words. As if he's a prosecutor standing in the well of the grand jury with this witness under oath, Justin Nastasi, and another one, Dan Capocci, both of whom owed money to Monticello. Tell them this, you two. Send them up there and ask the roll on tape of the prosecutor. Did you ever borrow money from Louis Monticello? Yes. Did you ever borrow money from Nicky Cimino? Yes. Did they ever charge you interest? No. Did they ever threaten you? No. Not once. Not twice. He sends Justin Capocci, Nastasi goes up there 4 times, and he says it on tape. And he's telling Frank the Fixer. Why? Because the government comes up with a scheme, and their scheme is, we're going to fake a grand jury subpoena, a state grand jury subpoena, for Frank DiGiacomo. Frank the Fixer's going to go in, and hear on the tape, hey, I got a ticket to the Tea Party. He tells Monticello, and Monticello starts scrambling. Oh, we got to get you a lawyer. We got to start talking about what you're going to say to the grand jury. And he begins the script. And the script is to benefit Louis Monticello. Not to protect George Borghese, as they've alleged, because he's not involved. His name only comes up when it's useful for Monticello. In his back pocket, it's his way out. You're going to see this develop step by step by step. Because I'm going to show you a cross-examination. Go to the grand jury. Do you borrow money from Louis Monticello? He's telling Mr. Frank the Fixer on tape. Yes, sir. Yes. He tells him yes. He's telling him what to say. In front of a lawyer. He conspires with a lawyer to do this. Did he charge interest? Does Louis Monticello, again, in the words of Louis Monticello, feigning those of a prosecutor standing in the well of a grand jury courtroom, this is what he's doing. This is how sophisticated he is. He builds in his own defense for the crimes he committed while he's committing them. He builds in his own defense for obstruction of justice while he's committing obstruction of justice. He builds in his own defense for supporting perjury. How? He tells Frank the Fixer, don't take the Fifth Amendment. He tells the lawyer, when the lawyer advises, don't take, we might take the Fifth. Don't take the Fifth Amendment. Why? Because he wants the Fixer to lie in the grand jury to protect him. Because if they find out about the lie, they can't use it. Because who would use a person who would send someone to suborn perjury? You couldn't trust them. You couldn't rely upon them. You wouldn't want to call them as a witness. But it's not once that he scripts this. It's not twice. Over the course of months, it is 10, 15, 17 times he is scripting. Almost every time he's with Frank DeFixer, this is what you're going to say to the grand jury. That's Louis Monticello trying to protect himself. Protect himself. Doesn't say it's George Borghese's money. Doesn't say go up there to protect George Borghese. Lie about George Borghese by Capo sitting in a cell in Beckland, West Virginia. Doesn't say that. Because the truth is, he's not involved. The truth of my client's innocence is in the government's own evidence in this case and lack thereof. Don't lose sight of it. Keep your eyes on the ball. So what happens? Monticello's still making money. And he knows the FBI's watching him because DiGiacomo says, I think they follow me on several occasions. We're just friends. He is so bold and so brazen that he continues his stops. He continues his extortion. He continues to make money, knowing that he's a target of a state grand jury investigation, a joint investigation between the FBI and the state police. But he's caught. He's caught. He's on tape. So they eventually charge him. But before they charge him, a MAID member, Marty Angelina, starts sniffing around his operation, and they have a beef. So this associate, this low man on the totem pole, and I want you to listen to the experts about how the mob operates. Listen to their testimony. How the structure of the organization operates. An associate threatening a MAID man, it's against the rules. Caprio will tell you, if that happens, you're dead. Monticello has no concern about any of that. He visits George Borghese twice a year. He lies to George Borghese about all that he's doing. He complains on the tape, not about owing George Borghese money. He owed back the line of credit for the $248,000 that he put out on Loan Sharky money. That's what he's complaining about. I gotta get this money. Fixer, Frank, I gotta get this money. Where's my money? Where's my money? He threatens one of his victims in the extortion, a guy named Frank Gallo Jr. He threatens to kill him. They got it on tape. You're dead. If you don't come on Tuesday, you're dead. This is Louis Monticello, who's their key witness. Guilty out of reasonable doubt, not guilty. Not guilty. He threatens the MAID man, Marty Angelina, threatens to kill him, and then changes his mind. You know what? We're only going to hurt him. We're only going to beat him up. I want you to listen to Frank Fixer, too. He's a beautiful con artist. He will say on one point, he's saying, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that, I'm worried about that. And he gets on the phone in the next conversation, and he's talking about money that he's going to get on the next job he has. He lies to everybody. Not only does he lie so effectively, he lies about Anthony Stato. He says that when Marty Angelina was allegedly beat up, that he talked to Stato and Stato knew about it. He crafts a lie. Sophisticated con artist crafts a lie about allegedly a mob member knowing about this. Nothing happens. Guilty out of reasonable doubt on every single charge in this indictment with respect to George Borghese. Truth of my client's innocence is built within this case. So Louis Monticello gets charged, and you know what? He cuts a deal. He gets charged. It's about 17 charges. It's suborning perjury. It's intimidation of witnesses. It's conspiracy. It's corrupt organization. And they charge him in state court as he pleads to a county sentence on 2 charges. I want you to listen very carefully on my cross-examination about how that comes about. On the solicitation to commit murder of Marty Angelina, he pleads to it. And on a case that he should get jail time, he gets 5 years probation. What's going on? Because they have a theory about what the mob is, and that my client who's in jail, who had an association, should somehow be tied into this. So we're going to create enough evidence based on someone who would support perjury to link him into something? It's outrageous. When I said the presumption of innocence, I said protection against abuse of power. Don't let it happen. Not with respect to George Borghese. So, with that in mind, in his back pocket, knowing he's got something to give, again, the deal maker, the man who will protect himself at all costs, on tape says, I'll take 10 to 20 years. Tell Mr. Olson from the state attorney general's office, tell him I'll take the 10 to 20 years. I'm the one they want. I'm the target. Me and Nick Cimino. Tell him I take the 10 to 20 years. Gets indicted in this case and makes a deal within 3 weeks with the government. Within 3 weeks. To testify against George Borghese. only go up in these negotiations. This is a deal with someone who's sworn perjury. This is a scripted deal. He scripted Nastasi's testimony to the grand jury. He scripted Capocci's testimony to the grand jury. He tried to script Frank the Fixer Giacomo, an undercover con artist working for the government, 15, 17, 18 times. Now he's going to write another script, and you're going to hear it. You're going to hear it. The government will introduce evidence of alleged incidents that occurred outside this conspiracy. They want you to shift your focus away from the lack of evidence, charge my client with this conspiracy, and focus on something that happened in 1998, 1999, and something that absolutely never happened. Mr. Labor mentions this Ray Sisto incident. Notice he doesn't mention the date. First of all, I'm going to cross-examine Mr. Monticello about this Ray Sisto incident in which he was involved in. Somehow he shifts the focus to my client, who my client proved it. My client did actually beat up a guy named Angelo Lux. He beat him up because he took $2,000 from him. And that was 1999, not within the scope of this conspiracy. They want you to shift focus away from the evidence in this indictment to things that happened before. Because the lack of evidence against my client, the truth of my client's innocence is in the lack of evidence in this case. So don't let their attempts to scare you shift focus and obscure the truth in this matter. Don't let the label of the mob and that association twist your sense of justice. Mr. Monticello cut a deal, the only deal he could. He's caught. He's got nothing. He's on tape. The same tapes they use, and we're going to use in the state case they're using in this case. And the truth of my client's innocence, again, is in the cross-examination of Mr. Monticello. Now, there are many witnesses that are going to testify that I'm going to have no questions. Why? Because my client has nothing to do with that other evidence. And there are some witnesses I will question very briefly. And when I do, listen very carefully, because it's going to be a piece of the puzzle that I'm going to go back and put together for you in closing. When I cross-examine Monticello, it's going to be a long time, because we got a lot of tapes, because they spent a lot of time on the focus on Mr. Monticello. Not the truth. So the script that Monticello writes for them is the story you're going to hear. The script that he wrote before for Frank DiGiacomo, you'll hear through cross-examination. At the end of this case, you're going to get instructions, explicit instructions from his own. He's going to give you instructions on how to evaluate witness testimony. He talked briefly about circumstantial and direct evidence. He's going to talk about the burdens, those twin guideposts that I talked about. Presumption of innocence, the burden on the government to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And he's going to give you instruction on witnesses. And what he's going to tell you is that everybody that led to accomplice to a crime should be evaluated, is a corrupt source that should be evaluated with caution. Their testimony has to be received with caution. That's Mr. Monticello. That's Mr. Giacomo, that immunity from the federal government to shape his cooperation. Don't let the truth be obscured by their attempts to scare you about what's involved in this case. Don't let it happen. Don't let the truth be obscured by stuff that happened outside this case. Look at this indictment as your guiding compass. If you look at this indictment as your guiding compass, and you apply those two principles, the presumption of innocence and the burden on the government to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, you're going to come to the only just and fair conclusion with respect to George Borghese, and that he's not guilty of the charges in this case. It's been 13 years. It's time to let him go home. Thank you for your time.
Who's next? Ms. Grasso, please.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You have 25 minutes.
Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good afternoon. I want to thank you, first of all, on behalf of myself and my client, Damien Canalicchio, who's seated over there in the back. My name is Maggie Grasso. You've gotten to this point, you've sat through jury selection, and I think you all figured out during the course of jury selection that the reason you're here is because both the government and the defense team all believe that you can be fair. And you've taken an oath to be fair, and we, as a defense team, certainly believe that you're going to be fair in this case. Keep an open mind, listen to all the evidence, and that you're here, as we all are here, the judge, the government, defense, for justice. And the only just verdict that you'll be able to reach with regard to Damian Canalicchio at the end of all the evidence is not guilty on all charges. I think as my colleague Mr. Santaguida said earlier, you've heard a lot of speeches, but the case isn't about the speeches. The speeches are, in the beginning, roadmaps, and at the end, they sort of tie the evidence together. But the case is about the evidence that comes from the witness stand or the lack of evidence from the witness stand. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to go through the evidence as it pertains to Mr. Canalicchio, what you can expect to hear regarding him and the charges that he's been charged with. As Mr. Hetznecker pointed out quite eloquently, we are going to ask you, as you listen to all the evidence, to bear in mind three very fundamental principles of our Constitution, which are the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, which is with the government and never shifts, and that burden is to prove all the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. We ask you to keep that in mind, and you'll be instructed by His Honor at the end of the case exactly what those words mean. But essentially, right now, what you know is that everyone sits before you innocent as charged. What is Damian charged with? Again, I'll quote Mr. Santaguida, I think he used the word compartmentalize. You are going to be asked when you go back to deliberate to look at each of the charges as it pertains to each of the defendants separately. With Damian, it's a little bit simpler in the sense that he's charged with 3 crimes. He's charged with the RICO conspiracy, which Mr. Jacobs talked about at length, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. He's also charged with the illegal gambling device, which is a video poker machine. He's charged with 1, with a video poker machine maintained in the First Ward Republican Club, which is a social club, as the government indicated. And thirdly, he's charged with bookmaking. Those are the 3 charges against Mr. Canalicchio. And I'm going to take them out of turn in the simplest way. The first, electronic gambling, which is the video poker machine in the First Ward Club. You will hear after testimony, the government said they're going to bring in the poker machine for you. You will see, and you will hear from their expert, that the poker machine in and of itself is not per se illegal. There's nothing about the machine being in the establishment that makes it illegal. It is only illegal if someone pays money out to people who play the game if they win. There are essentially no witnesses in this case who can say that Mr. Canalicchio had any knowledge that people were being paid out on that one machine in the First Ward. And that's the only machine you have to be concerned about with Mr. Canalicchio. There's absolutely no evidence. Kurt Arbitman, as the government indicated to you, is basically their star witness as it pertains to the video poker machines because he's the guy that serviced virtually all the machines. He's not going to give you any indication that Mr. Canalicchio was aware that payouts were being made on these machines. He was never present when a payout was made on these machines. There were multiple types of machines in this First Ward Club, by the way. There was pool tables, cigarette machines, candy machines, something called a Mega Touch machine, which is, you may be familiar with it, it's just a poker machine that's also not illegal, doesn't pay out any money. So there's multiple machines in this First Ward. The one that's allegedly a problem is the video poker machine. The only connection that the government is going to attempt to try to get Mr. Canalicchio with that poker machine is a conversation that he has with somebody else where he talks about the fact that things are going well at the bar. He's a member of the club, by the way, and he's in there, and there's an incident at the bar, and the bar's essentially cleared out. And the conversation basically says, things are going well, people were playing the machines, basically the bar's making money. And as a member of the club, the evidence will show he's an interest in the bar doing well. And that conversation alone is basically what the government will show you, what they believe amounts to him being guilty of this illegal poker machine. It's not evidence. It's evidence of nothing but he's innocent. He has nothing to do with this poker machine whatsoever. That one you can dismiss, I think, out of hand. When you come to the verdict sheet, you'll look at that one, and I think it'll be a very easy decision for you to make, and you will check not guilty almost immediately. The second count that you have to look at with regard to Mr. Canalicchio is the sports betting business. Bookmaking. I think we probably all have a common sense knowledge of what bookmaking is, and the judge will instruct you that when you sit here as jurors, one of the most important things you bring to the table is your common sense, your common knowledge. obviously you can't disregard the law that the judge gives you, but you can bring your common sense to the table. So bookmaking in this case is really what you would probably think it is. A bookmaker who gives lines on what game bets are, accepts bets, phones are ringing constantly, high level of activity, taking bets all the time. Those are the things that you would expect if one was a bookmaker. Well, none of that's present in this case with regard to Damien. In fact, we talked about the 15,000 phone calls or phone wire taps in this case. There are approximately 15,000 phone calls intercepted. A large majority of them pertain to Damien because the government had his cell phone tapped from September 30th, 2005 through June 3rd, I believe, 2006, which is roughly a 9-month period. And there are thousands of phone calls, literally. And you're going to hear very few of those conversations from the government. But what you don't hear on those calls is very telling. You don't hear Damien doing things that are indicative of a bookmaker. You don't hear him accepting bets. You don't hear him giving lines. There's not a high level of call activity on a weekend when games are taking place. None of the things that are indicative of a bookmaker are present. And so it's clear that 100% that he's not a bookmaker. So what the government has indicated to you is that, well, if he's not doing all that, he must be in partnership with somebody else who is a bookmaker, and he's collecting for him. And what the government has posited to you that the evidence will show is that he's collecting money for a gentleman by the name of Louis Beretta, whose nickname is Sheep. And you're going to hear me refer to him as Sheep right at the top. On their grid, Sheep is an associate who, according to their calculation, is below Damien. But Damien is the one who's making collections for Sheep. Again, the evidence of that amounts to the phone calls that you will hear Damien on the phone with various individuals. That evidence does not show that he's collecting money for Sheep. It doesn't show that he's in a bookmaking operation for himself. It doesn't show that he's in a bookmaking operation for anyone. It shows merely that he has placed a lot of bets and that he's a gambler. And that's what those tapes will show. And when you listen to them, and you listen to them carefully, I'm convinced that you will have no doubt that that's what's going on here. The government, in its opening, indicated that there'll be a phone call where Damien allegedly says to somebody, you bet with my friend Sheep, now you're out there betting with somebody else, you better pay Sheep back. And Damien refers to Sheep as my friend. Well, they are friends, and Damien bets with him. And Sheep is also a gambler himself. He's a bookmaker, and he's a gambler. And that one phone call means absolutely nothing, as I'm sure you're going to be intelligent enough to realize that phone call means nothing, especially when you take it into the context of many other phone calls that you're going to hear. Damien's talking about Sheep being he's a bookmaker, and he should be making a lot of money, but he's such a gambler himself, he's basically in the poorhouse. You hear there's conversations where Damien is basically laughing at the fact that the person he's allegedly in partnership with is making so much money. And it's all basically, as Mr. Santaguida sort of put things into context, that's the way people talk, and there's just friends talk among friends. But the bottom line is if somebody's in partnership with somebody, they certainly wouldn't be laughing about the fact that his partner's losing a lot of money. And that's what the evidence will show with regard to bookmaking. There's not one witness that's going to come in here and say that Damien's involved with the bookmaking who's not an FBI agent, a government expert. There's no bettors that are going to come in here and say that. And I think you need to take all the evidence in and basically put that into context and put it into the context with the phone calls that you hear. As Mr. Pagano said, it's very important when you hear these phone calls. And again, a lot of times what's going to happen is you're going to hear pieces of conversation. And I'll make sure that you hear the other portions of the conversation that are relevant, that show that Damien is not involved in any bookmaking activity. The third charge is the charge that Mr. Jacobs educated you a lot about, I believe, in the beginning of his opening, and that's the RICO conspiracy. They basically have to show an agreement, and they have to show a pattern of racketeering, and that the acts are related. That the acts, any actions that the government's going to put on are certainly not part of any agreement, and they're certainly not related in the way that the government would like you to believe they're related, such that he would be guilty of a racketeering conspiracy. I just want to talk a little bit about the evidence that they're going to put on with regard to that. And essentially, it boils down to 3 witnesses. And you've heard about the types of witnesses you're going to hear about in this case. The government's already told you, we're not going to put on, upstanding citizens as witnesses. With respect to one witness, Mikey Orlando, you'll hear quite a bit about as it pertains to my client. Mikey Orlando borrowed money from Damien. They were friends. Mikey Orlando is a criminal. He entered into a cooperation plea agreement with the government. The government filed what Mr. Jacobs told you was a 5K motion on his behalf so that he could get a reduced sentence. He was paid in this case for his time and for his expenses, and he basically wore a wire and set up Mr. Canalicchio as best as he could with regard to the money that he had borrowed. And he was basically told by the FBI to wear the wire and go out there and make the recordings, and that's what the recordings, you will hear them in this courtroom. He's been convicted of discharging a crime involving discharging a firearm. He's been convicted of fraud. He'll tell you that he staged car accidents. He was in a lot of trouble. He owed a lot of people money, not anybody in this room. And he was basically trying to work himself out of a hole with other people and the government. His own half-brother basically wore a wire against him and set him up, which is why he wound up in the position that he was in, to basically cut himself a deal and save himself. Listen to the conversations, listen to Damien's words, listen to Mikey's words, and keep an open mind as you listen to them on direct examination until you hear the cross-examination. So I think somebody else said something along these lines. There's very little talk as it pertains to loans with Damien, but there's absolutely no action. There is nothing that Damien has done that would make him guilty of anything as charged in this case. One interesting thing you should notice about Mikey is that he will say that he owed Damien money. Well, Damien's not looking for him. Basically, Mikey, after having owed him money for quite some time, of his own volition, after he's in trouble and he's on board with the government, goes to Damien to repay the money. Damien's not mad. He doesn't say, where the hell you been? You know, what the hell's going on? Where's my effing money? None of that. He basically says, let's just pay it back. And that's what you will hear. Another individual you're going to hear from, P.D. Albo. I think there's one recording that pertains to Mr. Canalicchio in that regard. Mr. Albo is another individual who got himself into some trouble on the street, decided he needed to save himself, went to the government, got on board with the government to cooperate. He was a friend of Damien's. He had been at his house. He had worn a wire on him on numerous occasions. And I think you're going to hear one conversation that the government thinks is somehow relevant and somehow ties Mr. Canalicchio into some sort of agreement with all these other people. Again, Mr. Albo is a convicted criminal with an extensive criminal history: burglary, theft, forgery, trespassing, shoplifting. He's also paid by the government in upwards of $13,000, which doesn't even include his expenses. And finally, there's one other individual, Joe Cummer, who you'll hear one conversation, I believe, at best, which, again, I'm not really even sure what the significance of it is, but he also is paid by the government and the criminal. And we tell you all this so that you can evaluate the witnesses as you hear from them on the stand, and you can make your own judgment about those individuals as you hear the evidence. It's a long investigation. I'm not going to belabor how many transcripts or audio recordings, but it was a 13-year investigation. A lot went on. You're not going to see any surveillance of Damien making pay-ups to anybody. You're not going to see any surveillance of Damien collecting money from anybody other than Mikey Orlando, who owed him money and he did receive money from. You would expect more if the government had a case against Mr. Canalicchio. The government's evidence basically boils down to a bunch of cooperators, a bunch of criminals. The government has a bunch of theories in this case, as you listen to them, that do not add up. They believe, they're going to tell you just a couple examples. La Cosa Nostra is a secret society, but you have all these people talking about all these things openly. You have a belief that there's a chain of command, but meanwhile, the chain of command, as you hear, even with Mr. Canalicchio and Mr. Beretta, it doesn't make sense. He's reporting to him, but yet he's under him. The government's theories just don't add up in this case, and I think once you listen to all the evidence, you'll be 100% clear that that's not, that the government's theory is just doesn't hold water. And when you evaluate all the evidence, there is only one verdict in this case with regard to Damien as it pertains to each and every count, and that's not guilty. And I thank you for your time now, and I thank you for your time throughout this trial.
Okay, it is now 2 minutes to 3. We'll take our afternoon recess, and we will come back at 3:15 and hear the last two opening statements. Okay, please be seated. Just reviewing tomorrow's program. There is a motion that is outstanding that the court has on their consideration, and I received Mr. Hetzneker's response. So what I'm going to do, I will decide that motion on the papers, and I'm going to do that overnight, and I'll get something done either today, but certainly by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Very well, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can I just bring something up, a logistical issue?
Yes.
The Rule 17
Right.
/order that Your Honor prepared and signed last evening, I had served on the Postal Service this morning. I've been statusing the progress on them getting those records by the return date, which is tomorrow morning. I don't know that they're going to be here tomorrow morning with those records, and my concern is I think Mr. Scipione is going to be the first government witness tomorrow. In the event that I don't have those records, I don't know that I'll be able to complete or finish my cross-examination in the event that we get to that point by the end of the day on Friday.
Let's see where we are with that tomorrow morning. They're gathering the records. Is that it? Okay. And they're going to be here with records, without records, to explain what's going on, right?
I think so.
Do you have a contact you're talking to there?
I haven't personally, but my office.
Your office has.
I'll go
Okay.
into details and
Fine. Very good.
training more.
Good. Okay, we're ready to proceed. Let's bring the jury in. Mr. Warren, will you be next or you last?
I believe I'm last, Judge.
Okay, so Mr. O'Connor, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. O'Connor has 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, please be seated. Okay, Mr. O'Connor, please, opening statement. You have the agreed upon 10 minutes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good afternoon. My name is Larry O'Connor. I represent Gary Battaglia. Thank you for your service on this jury.
statement that the prosecutor is trying to use to prove my client's involvement in this racketeering conspiracy. They want you to believe that the statement that my client used was a threat, and that that threat links my client to a racketeering activity. I imagine you all remember what that statement was. Right now, I want to put a bullet in your head. When you hear that statement in a vacuum, out of context, it does sound threatening. There's no question about that. And we don't dispute the fact that my client made that statement. It's on a recorded transcript. But when you understand the entirety of the relationship that my client has with the person that he made that statement to, and all the facts that led up to that, I think you'll understand that statement. And you'll see it was a statement made out of frustration and made out of anger, and not made as a threat. Now, it's a statement that my client, admittedly, has made to that person before. You have to understand that the person he made that statement to is a person that he's had a 30-year relationship with. That person's name is Peter Albo. And you may remember one of my colleagues mentioning Peter Albo's name. That he's a convicted criminal, that he has a long history of criminal activity, and that when he ran out of options in an attempt to save his skin, he ran to the federal government. He worked out a deal with them. And they were more than happy to work out a deal. And they compensated him significantly. I believe all told, between direct and indirect payments, payments of expenses, that compensation amounted to over $50,000 over the course of this investigation. Now, I can explain the relationship between my client and Mr. Albo. Mr. Albo and my client are, for all intents and purposes, family. Mr. Albo's sister is married to Gary Battolini's brother, which is why they've known each other for 30 years. And for 30 years, Pete Albo has been getting in trouble over and over again. And every time Pete Albo got in trouble, he ran to Gary Battolini asking for help. And every time Pete Albo asked Gary Battolini for help, Gary Battolini stood up for him and helped him. And when Pete Albo had to go away, on more than one occasion, Gary Battolini was the person that stepped up and took care of Mr. Albo's family. Kept the roof over their head, put food on their table, kept clothes on their back. Pete Albo just kept getting into trouble, more and more trouble. With drugs, with law, with gambling. And as I mentioned, in an effort to save his own skin and line his pockets with the government's money, he worked out an arrangement with the FBI. Now, Pete Albo and Gary Battolini, as I said, they've known each other 30 years. They're both guys from South Philadelphia. As another one of my colleagues mentioned a little while ago, South Philadelphia, they talk a little different than maybe the rest of us do. So a statement like, right now I want to put a bullet in your head, is the kind of thing guys in South Philadelphia say to each other all the time. Especially when they have a close enough relationship where it's understood he certainly doesn't mean it. But the government, because they were able to get that on tape, want to bring that in front of you and play that tape and have you believe that this is some kind of serious threat on Mr. Albo's life and some sort of attempt by Mr. Battolini collect money, collect a gambling debt. The truth is, and it will come out during testimony, is that this gambling debt wasn't money that Pete Albo, or wasn't a debt that was incurred by Pete Albo through gambling with Mr. Battolini. That's not what happened. What happened was Pete Albo got in debt with someone else. And as he'd done for 30 years, ran to Gary Battolini for help. Gary Battolini, again, stood up for Pete Albo. And he guaranteed that debt. That's the way things work in South Philadelphia. If I owe somebody money and I can't pay them, and I know someone that's got some money that can help me out, I'll go to that person and I'll say, you stand up for me on this. Can you help me out on this? And if that person agrees, then that person takes on that debt and that obligation on my behalf. And that's what happened here, Gary Battolini and Pete Albo. Now this statement that the government wants you to take out of context in a vacuum and believe is some sort of threat that links Mr. Battolini to a racketeering conspiracy, that statement is on a tape-recorded phone conversation, a call that Pete Albo made to Gary Battolini. After promising Mr. Battolini that there would be a $10,000 payment made on this gambling debt, Pete Albo calls him up and said, Gary, I can't pay. I can only come up with $2,650. There was actually 2 phone conversations that day. And on that first phone conversation, when Mr. Albo called and says, I can only come up with $2,650, Gary Battolini says, not my problem, Pete. You deal with it. You come to Philadelphia, and you deal with it. Because at that time, it wasn't Gary Battolini's debt. It wasn't until after that first phone conversation that Gary Battolini then has to reach out and say, I stood up for this debt, now I'm on the hook for this debt. So when Pete Albo calls back 2 hours later, saying, oh, doesn't this $2,650 show some sort of good faith on my part? Gary Battolini gets upset with him. And yet, in frustration and in anger, he does say, Pete, right now I feel like putting a bullet in your head. And it's something that they've said to each other many times over the 30 years. And admittedly, it's something that Gary Battolini said far more often to Pete Albo than Pete Albo said going the other way.
1 minute.
Gary Battolini was always the person that was protecting and standing up for Pete Albo.
1 minute, Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you. Again, I know you've heard a lot of information today, and I know it's late in the day. There's plenty of other information that I could present to you today. But I believe you need to understand the context and the relationship between Gary Battolini and Pete Albo to fully understand that that statement was not a threat. It was made in frustration and in anger. It is, quite frankly, a statement that any one of us could make in frustration and in anger over a lifetime of helping somebody out. 30 years standing up and going to bat for someone. 30 years of being disappointed by that person. 30 years of paying that person's bills. I think we can all understand that frustration. And I think we can see that that statement was not made as a threat. And actions speak louder than words here, folks. Even if you believe that it was a threatening statement, there was nothing to back that up. There was no action. There was no physical violence by Mr. Battolini against Mr. Albo. In fact, there's not going to be any testimony or any physical violence by Mr. Battolini against anybody in this case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Warren, please. You have 15 minutes.
Good afternoon, folks. How are you all doing? Glad to hear it. My name is Christopher Warren, and I represent this gray-haired gentleman seated right there. His name is Joseph Licata. You're going to hear him referred to in this case by the nickname Scoops. Okay? Now I know you all have heard lots and lots and lots of information. You have heard names and allegations slung around this courtroom in the morning and in the afternoon. Let me take a couple of my minutes here and try and distill down what I suggest you've heard this morning. These people over here, the United States government, as a colleague of mine once said, they print their own currency, they fought and won 2 world wars. They say that these are a bunch of violent gangsters who hurt and injure people and trade on the mafia's reputation for violence. That, in a nutshell, was their presentation. We say that is nonsense, and the way they intend to prove their charges is to trot out before you admitted murderers, liars, and thieves. And that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is the competing presentations that you have had put to you today. So that is what we say, and that's what the folks who print their own currency and fight and win world wars say. And make no mistake, they are formidable opponents. They are the United States government. Now, they brought up a chart, and they had my gray-haired client, who's right there, on there as a capital regime. And you may be asking yourself, why would they say that? Well, the reason they would say that is because my client stood up in a federal courtroom in Newark, New Jersey in 1999, and he admitted that between 1990 and 1994, that is 18 to 20 years ago, okay? 18 to 20 years ago, my guy gets up and he tells a federal judge that between 1990 and 1994, I was associated with Lou Fazzini, a guy named Nicholas Oliveri, Dennis Christie, James Polidori, Carmen DeArchie, and others in an enterprise that engaged in a conspiracy to make and collect extortionate extensions of credit, as well as various types of gambling activity in northern New Jersey and New York, which affected interstate commerce. So 18 to 20 years ago, he did precisely what they're accusing him of now. Okay? He admitted that. That was a long time ago. And they can't take what he admitted to before to convict him of what he did in this case. So what happens is, 18 to 20 years ago, he admits that this enterprise was the North Jersey faction of the Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra, pled guilty, admitted it, told the judge, this is what I did, this is one of the things. Also told the judge that the purpose of the enterprise was to make money, admitted that to the judge. He did it 18, 20 years ago. Participated in the conduct of this enterprise's affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity. Fancy legal words mean gambling and lending money to people and charging 45% interest. 18 to 20 years ago, he did that. That the gambling business he had involved five or more people, none of whom are seated in this courtroom, by the way. That it was in business for at least 30 days and made about $2,000 on one or more days. I did that 18, 20 years ago. I did that, folks. That between 1990 and 1994, again, almost 2 decades ago, along with guys who are not here, we conspired to lend money to people and charge them 45% a year interest. Did that almost 2 decades ago. And told them that if they delayed making repayments, or if there was a total failure to repay, violence or other criminal means would be used to force repayment, and that he knew what he was doing was wrong. Now, my client stood up and admitted that. All right? That was 18 to 20 years ago. And in 1999, as a result of what he admitted to, my client received a sentence of 55 months in prison. So in 1999, when this conspiracy starts, my client is languishing in a federal prison cell, having already pled guilty to and been punished for the very agreement I just read to you. He then stays in jail until 2003. He is then on supervised release, which is basically you're being supervised by a federal probation officer. Another 3 years. In order for them to convict him in this case, they got to show more than he just stayed with the mafia. Because as my colleagues have pointed out, being in the mafia is not the crime. Okay? Committing criminal activity or agreeing that others will commit criminal activity, that's the crime. Now, what crimes do they say he agreed to commit, either himself or through somebody else? They say he was running a bookmaking operation and conspiring to help somebody else get a false job. Okay? That's what I would like you to focus on. Let's take this mafia and capital regime stuff right out of the case right now. All right? Make them prove what it is they say he did after he got out of jail. Because once you plead guilty and you're punished for something, in this country, we don't keep locking you up again and again and again for the same thing. So let's see what evidence they come forward with that actually proves these charges. I suspect what they are going to do is rely on tapes made by this fella, Nicky Skins Stefanelli. Now that's the fella who was the inside man for the Gambino crime family. And Mr. Labor points out that Nicky's not with us anymore, that Nicky is dead. Wow. Boy, that sounds really bad. We got mafia allegations here. The poor fellow who recorded these tapes is dead now? Implication being that somebody in this room is responsible for that? No. Mr. Stefanelli killed himself. Killed himself. Mr. Pagano told you about Scipione, who wanted to kill himself after going to work for the government. Stefanelli did it. He actually killed himself. Not because of anything we did, but because of his own personal demons. But he killed himself, and we didn't have a blessed thing to do with that. So because Mr. Skins kills himself, they're going to have to...
We would impose an objection at this time.
Basis?
Lack of foundation.
Well, there has to be a good faith effort that you're going to prove what you're discussing now, and that's a limitation that you have to pursue.
I assure you, there's going to be testimony in this case that Nicky Skins Stefanelli killed himself last February 2012.
You know, my objection was as to the reason for that.
To the reason for
The
it?
reason for that.
Okay.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen,
Sustain as to the reason and is overruled as to the fact.
all right. At any rate, I expect you're going to hear testimony that Nicky Skins Stefanelli killed himself in February 2012, and that we had nothing to do with it. Secondly, that is the reason why you are going to hear from expert witness Agent Joaquin Garcia. They've got to put a live human being up there and, quote, interpret these tapes for you. Focus on this. These tapes, you're going to get transcripts. There's a whole big book of them, okay? You're going to get transcripts. There are transcription errors in these tapes, okay? What is on the printed page is not necessarily what the people talking said. So pay very, very close attention to what you hear, not to what the government transcribers typed up. Because it's what the people said, not what they think the people said, that counts. Mr. Labor said that this meeting in May, I think it's 2010, at a restaurant was, and I quote, a discussion of serious mob business, not just chit-chat. It was like head coaches or a board of directors meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear that the FBI's own paperwork describing the purpose of this meeting says that it was a social meet. Listen to this stuff. I suggest when you listen to this stuff, there's not going to be a blessed word about ongoing criminal activity described. What you're going to hear, quite frankly, folks, is a bunch of geriatric gangsters waxing nostalgic about things that have long ago occurred in the past. That's what you're going to hear. You're not going to hear discussions of ongoing criminal activity. You may hear discussions of what's this guy doing, what's this guy doing, but there is no discussion of ongoing criminal activity. And what did I say? They told you, and I wrote this down, Mr. Labor said, and I quote, that the reason for this meeting is there was a beef with the Genovese crime family. Okay?
Yeah, I misspoke.
Basis?
Yeah, I'm just saying I misspoke.
Okay.
I think he wants to reopen it.
No, I made a mistake.
Well, you have to wait for your chance to
Yes,
do that. Please proceed.
Oh, you misspoke. Okay. All right, well, what he said is there was a beef with the Genovese crime family. Well, there wasn't a beef with the Genovese crime family. What they're claiming is there was a problem with the Lucchese crime family. And what he says is the reason they had this meeting in 2010, okay, is because the Lucchese crime family is trying to poach members from the Philadelphia crime family. And to prevent this from happening, the Philadelphia crime family meets with the Gambino crime family so they can get the full weight, force, and majesty of the Gambino crime family behind them. All right, you want to know when this alleged poaching occurred? Sometime when the guy who's supposed to be poached, which is Lou Fazzini, is in jail. Lou Fazzini is in jail between 1999 and 2003. He is supposedly poached sometime, or attempted to be poached sometime between 1999 and 2003. According to them, they don't get around to dealing with this poaching issue until 2010. That is ridiculous. Ridiculous. This was a social meeting exactly the way it was described in the FBI's paperwork. One last point, and I am going to sit down. I told you that what these Stefanelli conversations are is a bunch of geriatric gangsters waxing nostalgic about the old days. You are going to hear a tape, and I don't mean anything bad about calling my client geriatric. He's 71 years old, all right? He likes to socialize and hang around with the old guys. But socializing and hanging around with the old guys is not a crime. And I'll finish up with this. This is a tape I suspect you're going to hear. It's recorded in April 2011, and my client is telling a story. He refers back to 1968, when Frank Sinatra was singing at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. And they tell a story how one of the gangsters back in the 60s didn't want to see Frank Sinatra because one time when Frank was singing, the gangster started talking, and Frank told him, hey, the people came to see me, not hear you. They then go on to have a discussion about who's better, Frank Sinatra or Bobby Darin. What about Elvis? At which point, somebody says that the women liked Elvis so much that my client says they were throwing their skivvies, at which point my client points out that Tom Jones, all Marone, Tom Jones was the guy. This, folks, is a history lesson, okay? There's a word in the English language, it's called anachronism. And it's somebody who doesn't belong in this particular place and time. My client went to jail, my client got out. They won't even be able to put him in Philadelphia but for 2 occasions, to attend one guy's wedding and to go to a Christmas party. The only evidence, quote unquote, that they have of any ongoing criminal activity is a series of tapes in which they don't discuss ongoing criminal activity. One last thing. Before you take these tapes at face value, they told you about a story where Lou Fazzini pricks his finger and he gets blood all over his shirt. And he keeps this shirt. Well, the FBI listened to that. You know what they did? They went to Fazzini's house because that bloody shirt would be pretty damning evidence, wouldn't it? And they seized about everything they could. Guess what they did in front? A bloody shirt. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, counsel. This concludes the opening statements for today. And we are finished for today, and we will resume tomorrow morning, again at 9:30, and pursuant to your own arrangements. So let me just remind you again, please do not discuss the matter among yourselves or with anyone. Leave your notes here in the courtroom. Do not watch, listen, or read any accounts of the case, if there are any. And I will see you tomorrow morning at 9:30.
I steal your lines all the time.
Okay, please be seated. Are we all set for tomorrow in terms of production, et cetera?
Yes, Your Honor, we are.
Okay, so and we have that motion. I'm going to rule on it, and we're ready to roll tomorrow for the day. Okay.
Very good. Yes, now, Judge, so there's no misunderstanding. We're told that Henry Scipione will be the lead-off witness.
That's correct.
Okay.
All the exhibits pertaining to that witness have already been provided.
Okay, so he's the first witness. Very good. See you tomorrow morning.
The second one is Agent Martinelli, and we will have ruled on that.
Absolutely. Okay, very well.
Thank you, Judge.